Welcome to Tech Talks. Our security edition today is focused on app building the easy way with Splunk Phantom. Tech Talks is a series of short webinars that are deep dives for technical practitioners. We value you, our customer, and want you to continue in your Splunk journey. Our experts help create these best practices, and we want you to leverage them in your daily role. I'm Olivia Courtney, a security product marketing specialist, and I'm excited to share with you information about Splunk Phantom with my colleague Ian Forrest, the Principal Product Manager for our SOAR product. Today we're going to talk about what a Splunk Phantom app is. We'll explain the Phantom App Wizard. We'll walk you through the basics of app building and teach you techniques to have your actions running in 30 minutes or less. We'll then cover additional resources available to help you take advantage of Phantom capabilities in Splunk. And if you have any questions, please continue the conversation through the Tech Talk discussions in the Splunk community at splunk.com/techtalk. For a security team to do its job, they're obviously using many different security tools from different vendors. When responding to a security incident, each one of those tools plays a different role. Phantom integrates with all of those tools through apps, which is just a cool word for integration points with other tools. Through apps, Phantom can direct all of those other tools to perform actions in a particular sequence. For instance, tell virus total to check file reputation, or tell your Cisco firewall to block an IP. So Phantom is allowing the security team to coordinate all of those workflows across all of your tools. You can think of it like a symphony orchestra. If all of those tools are different instruments of a symphony orchestra, each instrument performs a specific role to make music, and Phantom is your conductor, making sure that every instrument is playing in sync and on time. Phantom supports over 300 of these apps, and if you have a tool that we don't have an app for, we can build that for you, or you can build your own with our app builder. As long as it has an API on the back end of it, we can integrate with it. And across those 300 apps, we can perform more than 2,000 different actions. A Splunk Phantom app has two basic interfaces: an interface to interact with an external device or service to implement an action, and an interface to interact with Splunk Phantom platform to run actions, send progress messages, and return action results. The app framework created by our app wizard will contain sample code that does both. So what's the easiest way to build these apps, and how do you use the app wizard to do so? I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Ian to show you. Take it away, Ian.
Thanks, Olivia. A while ago, I wrote a blog about integrating with the Zoom app in Phantom. So today we'll take a look at how I did that from beginning to end. Now, the first place to start whenever you're thinking about creating a new integration is the API documentation for the product with which you want to integrate. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the Zoom API documentation now. So I have the Zoom API documentation open, and one of the things that I want to take a look at is what information do I need to be able to authenticate to Zoom. And so we take a look at the different API authentication mechanisms for Zoom, and there's OAuth, OAuth roles, there's JWT. JWT is JSON Web Tokens, and that's what we're going to use for this type of authentication. So if I take a look here, I need to create a JWT app in the marketplace, which I've already done, so we're not going to walk through how to do that in Zoom. And then we're going to look at the JWT with Zoom guide. So we'll go ahead and open that in a new tab here. And the JWT with Zoom guide tells me about a couple of things that I'm going to need to have. One is I need an API key and secret. So we should probably write this down to make sure that we remember that those are two things that we're going to need to be able to connect to the Zoom API. And then I need to kind of be able to create a JSON Web Token. Now, whenever I'm working with standardized technology like this, one of the great things about Python is that there's plenty of Python modules out there that help me do these things very quickly. So doing a quick search on the internet, I found that there is indeed a Python JWT module that I can leverage to help me with kind of encoding my payloads and decoding my payloads for JWT connections. So we'll go back to the JWT documentation here, and we can see that we have a payload format that we need to have to create our JSON Web Token, and then we have the example in Node and curl and PHP and Python for how to then authenticate to the API using the JSON Web Token. So here I can see I just need to send an authorization header with bearer and then the token that was generated with a content type of application/JSON. We'll take a look at users, and we'll take a look at this get a user action. When we take a look at this get a user action, there's a couple things that we want to pay attention to. The key thing we want to pay attention to is any parameters that we need to pass in to the get a user API command. So we'll take a look at that, and I need to be able to pass in a user ID. This is important, and we'll want to write this down because this is going to be the parameter that we pass into our get user action when we create our integration for our app in Phantom. The next thing that we want to do is we want to pay attention to the data that is returned. So we can see the schema of the data that's returned and an example of the data that's returned. This is going to be important when we create our action results JSON that documents all of the data that's returned so that we can easily use these actions in our playbooks. And then we can take a look down here at a sample request if we want and see what the code might look like in a variety of different things. But the most important thing that we can see here is what is the API endpoint that we're actually hitting. So our base URL looks like it's api.zoom.us/v2, and then we hit the users endpoint and we pass in the user ID as a parameter. This is going to be important when we go ahead and create our integration on the Phantom side. So now that we have a little bit of this information, we're going to go back to Phantom and start creating our integration. So what I'm going to do is go to the apps section of the product. Go to the app wizard. And the app wizard is going to ask me for information about my app. So I'll go ahead and type in some information here. Now we do need to upload an app logo here, and we'll need a light and dark theme app. Now luckily, I've already downloaded the Zoom logo, so we'll go ahead and use that. So I'm going to drag this from my other screen here, and I'll have my light theme and dark theme logo here. Now we're going to go to our asset configuration. And if we remember correctly, there was a few things that the Zoom integration wanted us to have. One of them was an API key, and the other was an API secret. But there's a few other things that I always recommend whenever we're creating an integration. One is the base URL. In this case, the base URL, if we go back to the Zoom documentation and take a look at the get users API, we can see that the base URL is going to be https api.zoom.us/v2. So we'll go ahead and put the base URL parameter in there, and we'll say it's a type string, and we'll also mark it as required. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say verify server cert. So verify that the server cert is from a trusted CA or not. And so we'll go ahead and leave that as not required because it's a Boolean, it's a checkbox. The next field that we need is the API key. And we'll make this a password field, and we'll mark that as required. And the next is an API secret. And we'll make this a password field and also mark it as required. And we can put our descriptions in here, base URL for Zoom API, verify, and we'll say API key and API key. Now we're going to go to the app actions section. And the app actions section lets us look through a bunch of pre-created action names that we can leverage for this. And it's good to use a pre-created action name if you can, rather than creating a new action name, because we want to try to adhere to a standardized set of action names within Phantom. It makes a lot of other things easier for management and for organizational purposes. Now, if we look through these different app categories, we can look to see if there is a get user action that was already created. And I think I saw in the DevOps category, there actually is an action called get user. So I'll go ahead and move this over, And sure enough, we'll see that the get user action has been added. Test connectivity was also added. That's always added for every app. And from here, I can see there is a user, there's a field name. So these are my parameters for my get user action. It had identifier in there. I'm going to rename that to user ID because that's the name of the field from Zoom that I want to provide here. And then we'll put in a description that's a little bit different than what was before. So we'll say user ID of Zoom user. And since this is all we're creating, we'll go ahead and hit the submit button down at the bottom. And I should have a tarball that has my scaffolding for my Zoom integration built for me. What we'll see in the code that was generated for us is a couple of things. We'll see our logo files were included. We'll also see a const file, which largely I'm going to ignore today. We'll see a Python file that's _connector.py. This is where the implementation of our connectivity to the Zoom API will be written, and also a JSON file. And we'll start with the JSON file. So the JSON file has all of the metadata that describes our app's capabilities. And there's a couple of key pieces of information here. So obviously there's the detail at the top, but then we have a configuration section. And this is where we tell Phantom, when we're configuring an asset or an instance of this app, what configuration details do we need? So we need a base URL. We need to be able to verify or turn off the verify server cert option. And we need an API key and an API secret. And we can see the data type is password and the required type is true, which is exactly what we put into the API wizard. Additionally, under actions, we'll see that there's two actions defined, one called test connectivity and one called get user. And the get user has a parameter of user ID. So all of this is great information for us. And lastly, we have this section for documenting output. And this is where we would define the data paths that are outputted by this particular action. Now, if we go into our Python file, we'll see that we have scaffolding code for creating this integration. So we'll see, a bunch of things for processing data returned from REST API calls. We'll have a make REST call action that's available to us, or function that's available for us to leverage when we want to make REST calls, so we don't have to roll our own. We also have handle test connectivity, which is where we'll write our code to implement the test connectivity capability of the app. And also handle get user, which we'll use to write the code that actually runs the get user action of the app. And then we have this handle action section. And you can think of the handle action as the routing section of the code. So when Phantom makes a request, it calls handle action, it passes in an action ID, and then we put this logic in here to say if the action ID is test connectivity, then run the code that I have now pasted code that I already wrote for the Zoom API in here that implements the actions that I want to implement. So we can take a look at the changes that were implemented here. So here we can see make REST call has been augmented to include the creation of the Java web or JSON web token. And we see that the header was modified to include that bearer token format and a user agent of Zoom JWT request. We can also see that handle get user was implemented here with the information that we need to be able to run that action. So you can see here I'm getting the user ID parameter that's passed in as one of the parameters for the get user action. And then I'm calling users / and then the user ID as my make REST call. But the next question is how do I test this? One of the easier ways to kind of build and test your integrations is by leveraging a open source project, which can be found here. And this is my repo. This is an open source project that anyone can leverage, but this is called the Phantom Test Harness. And all you have to do is download this project and include it in your Python path. And what it essentially does is it allows you to test any Phantom app locally without actually having to change any of the code. It gives you everything that you need to be able to let all your Phantom includes in your Python code to work without breaking, without actually having to have all that code on your box. So this documentation gives you an example of how to kind of download it and leverage it, and we'll walk through an example of that now. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a test me file. So I'm going to go over here and say, let's create a new file and call it zoom test me.py. And I'm going to use it to test the capabilities of my Zoom integration locally before I try to test it in my Phantom instance. So there's a couple of things that I want to do. One is I want to import my Zoom connector code. So I'm going to say from Zoom integration demo connector, import Zoom integration demo connector. I'm also going to import YAML. And the reason that I'm going to import YAML is I've got the API key and API secret in a YAML file, so I don't have to show anyone on this call my API key and API secret, or not on this call, on this video, my API key and my API secret. So I'll go ahead and say with open /config test me .yaml as config file YAML data equals YAML.load config file. And then we're going to create an instance of my Zoom app. So I'm going to say Zoom equals Zoom integration demo connector. And then I'm going to set up my configuration for this particular instance. So I'll say zoom.config. And this is sort of like setting up an asset in Phantom. So I'll say, what is my base URL? My base URL is https api.zoom.us/v2. And my API key is, now this is where I would actually paste in my API key, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want you guys to see my API key. So instead I'm going to include this, pull it out of the YAML file that I mentioned earlier. So I'll say YAML data API key and my API secret. Again, I don't want you guys to know what that is, so I'm going to pull that from my YAML file and put API secret. And then I'll say verify server cert is true. And again, this is just like if I were to set up an instance of my app or an asset in Phantom. These are the configuration values that I'd want to use for that asset instantiation. So then I'll call zoom.initialize. And initialize is just one of the functions that's available that kind of initializes the instance when we're running an action. And then I'm going to say my zoom.action identifier is get user. And then lastly, I'm going to call zoom.handle action. And if we recall, handle action is expecting, so we'll look for def handle action. Oops. Let's see, search for handle action. Well, we call that it's looking for a param list. And these are the parameters for the action that I actually want to run. And again, if we look at our Zoom get user action, the parameter that I want to pass in is user_ID. So we'll go ahead and say, I want to pass in a dictionary of parameters, and my user ID is the parameter that I want to pass in. And in this case, the user ID that I'm passing in is, it's a valid Zoom user ID that I pulled from my Zoom account. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to test our Zoom integration leveraging the Python test harness and our test me file. So I'm going to type python3 zoom test me.py and run that. And so we'll see what happened here. So I can see, okay, load state was run. I can see save progress was run. And it says in handler action for get user, which is good. But then we got an error, and it looks like it says JWT is not defined. So we'll go back in our code and kind of take a look at that. So we'll look for the get user action, and we can see, okay, well, it got to save progress in handler for, and then we can see, get user, which is good. And then it tried to make a REST call. We also see that it said, now I'm here, which is pretty cool. So any of the print statements that we have in here will show up in this data here. So I see now I'm here. And then it failed right after that. So it looks like it failed in our make REST call. So let's take a look at def make REST call. And we can see, okay, well, what we're doing, okay, look, we see a mention of JWT here. Let's take a look at that function, def get JWT. And we can see, oh yeah, JWT has got an underline under it, and it says JWT is not defined. So my guess is that when I copy and pasted my code, I didn't import the JWT module. So if we go to the top of this code, yep, sure enough, the import of the JWT module that I found is not included here. So I'll say import JWT and save. And we'll go ahead back to our testing file and take a look at this. So I'll go Python 3, zoom testme.py. And sure enough, my code is working now as expected. I got my load state, my save progress. I'm in handler for get user. I can see now that I'm in the make REST call method. And then I called .add data. And this is the data that was added. So these are the results of my get user action. So my account ID, my CMS user, all these different things that are returned by the Zoom API. And then I can see that set status was true. So I said, okay, we successfully retrieved the user information for this particular user, which is actually, that's exactly what we wanted to do. If we go look back into our Zoom integration, we can see kind of where all that code actually was. So get user. And we can see, yep, now I'm here. And then we called the REST call, and there was some code that was added here. And then we can see that we looked at the response that was returned from make REST call and said, is it a failure or not? And then we went to add data, and we took our response from our REST call and we added it. And we can see that this is the data that was actually added to that. And then finally, we can see that our status was set to success, and that user information for the user ID that we supplied was successfully retrieved. And we can see message user information was successfully retrieved. And then additionally, if we wanted to, we could add another message in here just to validate that we got this far. So we'll say print hello, and then we'll try this one more time. And we will run this. And we can see, yep, sure enough, there's my hello message, and there's my true. And so the point of this, so the next part of this is just to test that this does indeed work in Phantom. And so what we can do is we can tar this up, we can install it on Phantom, and then validate that it works. I'm not going to go through the process of testing how to tar and install an app on Phantom, because again, that's well documented in the tutorial. But we'll just kind of verify that this does indeed work end to end. So I'll search for Zoom. I'll go to unconfigured apps, and we'll go to configure a new asset. Here, I'll call my asset Zoom. We'll go to our asset settings. And notice that we have a base URL, which has a default value of api.zoom.us/v2, which is what we put in our app wizard and was subsequently what was in our JSON file. You have a verify checkbox, which I'll mark as checked, and then a field for API key and API secret, which I'll fill out right now. And I'll copy these out of my YAML file. And again, the YAML file is not necessary. It's just a way for me to be able to do this demo without actually showing you what my API key and secrets are. Now I'll paste my API secret, and we'll save this, and we'll validate that test connectivity worked. And that looks like that passed. And then we'll go to our events queue. And we'll add a new event, and we'll call it Zoom test get user, and save it. And we can see I've done this a couple of other times. And we'll click on Zoom get test get user, And I don't need to create an artifact. I just want to test the user action. So I'll go to Action. I'll search for Get User. I'll look for my Zoom asset, and then I'll paste my user ID that we were using for our test case. So in this case, that user ID was this guy. So we'll go ahead and now launch with that value and validate that it indeed works the way that we're expecting. So here I can see my Zoom integration ran, and it says user information was successfully retrieved. So we'll click on the results of that and take a look at our JSON data. And sure enough, there is the user information that we saw in our test me results. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll pass it back over to Olivia to close out the webinar.
Thank you, Ian. We're about ready to wrap up this Tech Talk, but before we do, I wanted to share quick resources available to you to continue on your journey. Check out our documentation for an in-depth guide on how to develop apps. There's also a tutorial on the App Wizard. Head over to Splunk Base and see our collection of Phantom apps. They're all listed there. And Ian's blog, Zoom In on Security in a Remote Work World, will show you an example of an app, in this case Zoom, and how it helps security operations. And don't forget that we have an incredible community of Splunk users on our community site. You can search the Answer section on security. You can continue the conversation for this talk within the discussion section called Tech Talks at splunk.com/techtalk, where you will find all the additional resources. And finally, there's Splunk Ideas, where you can submit new product enhancements or vote for current ideas from other customers. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to join us today. Please tune back in for future Tech Talks. We are excited to share this series with you.